Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Christians Questions, a project of the New Tolerance Campaign. Today I have Mason, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing his last name, Goad. Please correct me if
Yep.
I'm mispronouncing it, who is a research fellow at the National Association of Scholars and who recently released a bombshell support on students for justice in Palestine and their various connections around the country. Many viewers will be aware that Students for Justice in Palestine has been one of the leading groups organizing the encampments and protests that swept the country in the early half of 2024. So this is a very timely topic. I think it's a very pertinent topic as we go into a new era, and these kinds of protests are not expected to die down anytime soon. So Mason, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, for our viewers who might not be aware, tell us how you would describe Students for Justice in Palestine and what brought about your interest in them.
I describe them twofold. Earlier this year, I was at George Washington University. SJP had set up an encampment there, and that's right in the heart of DC. So I spent about 3 or 4 days and several hours each time, just sort of walking around the camp and observing people. And one of the things that I noticed was that the camp was it wasn't unified. Okay, so you have participants, and the general participants, I'd say, they didn't really believe in what they were protesting. They didn't understand it. They didn't care to understand it. They were there for sort of the novelty and adventure of it all. And, the truth is that from what I observed among the general participants, it was rather childish. And I mean, quite literally, there was sidewalk chalk, arts and crafts. You had people huddled up, knitting things. And of course, it was all geared toward Palestinian liberation or whatever slogan they were working on. But um, among the general participants, it was relatively childish and quite insincere. The same cannot be said of the organizers, all right? People who were out there with the megaphones, wearing the vest, ordering people around, they clearly bought into to the rhetoric. They were willing to clash with police. I watched that happen, I don't know, 2 or 3 times over those couple of days of just getting up in the face of campus police. I watched one officer basically threaten to tackle one of the protesters if she didn't move out of his way. So it was very clear there was a distinction between just the general camper and the leadership of SJP. And so, of course, one of the questions that came to mind as I was walking around was how did they build this? All right, you have a bunch of city folks. Did they all just learn how to pitch tents? I'm from the South. I grew up camping, so it's not difficult for me. But you had a bunch of clearly people who've never been hiking, much less camping, and now they've set up all these tents and they have all this food and they have this merchandise and all of these flags and prayer rugs and professionally made posters. And the question is, where did all of that come from? Who is organizing this truly? Because I mean, I met the organizers of the camp, but who is providing the funding? Who is providing the orders? How is SJP actually structured? And of course, that question ran through my mind for a couple months until about June of this year, when I realized that, at least in regard to SJP's leadership, their organizational structure, and their affiliated groups, they may have actually betrayed that information through social media because you had a bunch of chapters and SJP affiliated social media administrators who were choosing to follow certain people, right? So they were following their own leadership, they were following their national leadership, and they were following the affiliated groups. So all we did was take a sample of about 100 of these chapters, all throughout the country, as well as 5 geographic regions or 5 or 6 geographic regions. And then we just looked at their following list and we compared and contrasted all 111 lists to see who appears most often. And so this is a technique called an association matrix. Sometimes it's referred to as a link analysis matrix. But the idea basically is that if you want to find hidden connections between parties, you generate lists of who they interact with or who they seem to hold in high regard. And then if you find duplicates among all of the various lists, you can get a pretty clear picture as to who's the most influential uh, players in their social network, right? As well as some of their leadership. So that's all we did. We collected the list, we compared them, we rank ordered them, and then we know who are the most influential groups that SJP has dealings with, and we know who some of the local leaders are of the SJP chapters because they're being followed uh, by their local chapter social media administrators. So.
What was the most shocking detail that emerged in your report? You're alluding to your report, I believe, the Instagram, the Intifada report that you
Mhm.
put out that went viral. What is the most shocking detail that you learned in that report that shocked even someone like you who had a familiarity with SJP?
I would say probably the most shocking thing was the connections I saw to certain communist groups. Now, I'm not particularly surprised by it. I've done some additional research. I have two essays up on Minding the Campus, which is the National Association of Scholars sort of blog. And I have two essays up, and one traces the anti-racist movement, the so-called anti-racist movement, back to Soviet influence operations. And I have another tracing the Palestinian liberation movement, also back to Soviet influence operations. And I show the Russian documents, the top secret Russian documents that were stolen by dissident Vladimir Bukovsky. And people have kind of forgotten about them. So you can, I encourage people to go read those essays for a history lesson. But what I wasn't expecting to see and very clearly saw was the connections that SJP has even among the Marxist groups that exist today. I didn't expect that really to come out in this. I expected Palestinian orgs, of course, certain maybe UN groups and things like that, but they were clearly affiliated with some communist groups around the country. And, that was interesting to me. I'm not surprised at the neo-Marxist uh, affiliations because of the history that I mentioned that I've researched in the past, and also because when I was at the GW camp, we'll call it encampment, there was a couple students who were actually discussing Marx openly with what I suppose you might call a small library of Marxist material. So that was probably the most shocking thing, or the affiliations that SJP had to communist organizations.
Yeah, and we can do a little bit of insider baseball here because a lot of folks don't realize that a lot of the Palestinian revolutionary movements in the region of Israel are also expressly Marxist-Leninist as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of folks tend to believe that this entire debacle over Gaza, Israel, however one feels about it, is relevant to what I'm about to say, is entirely about a humanitarian impulse or entirely about a territorial belief or entirely about a historical impulse. It may very well be all of those things, either separately or all put together. But it also is for a section of the people that are revolutionaries against Israel, a desire to install a Marxist-Leninist government. And so I would like you, if you can, go a little bit into that because I think that, if you look at some of the groups that have been protesting as well here in America on their website, they will say we desire to have a revolution where we overthrow global capitalism. Israel is a manifestation of global capitalism, therefore it's bad. And I think that a lot of people miss this angle because what they'll do is they'll say this is entirely about anti-Semitism. I don't deny that it very well may be about anti-Semitism, but it's also about this socialist vision, which I think in some cases may outrank any sort of anti-Semitic overtones this have. What do you think about what I just said?
I'd say it might be half and half. I still think anti-Semitism is a major driver, of course.
Hmm.
Of Naturally, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we can't exactly blame the Soviets for continuing influence operations. But that's not to say that Russia or the Chinese Communist Party aren't still promoting this to drive social discord, which was the goal. That was the goal from way back in the day, was just to destabilize the American societal fabric, and that will help to destabilize the government. And if the government's destabilized, they're distracted from what the Soviets or Russia today and what the Chinese communists wanted to accomplish in the world. So, there are things like that are going on, but uh, I would say it's partially a continuation of those influence operations. It's partially anti-Semitism. I think it's partially just the spirit of Cain, let's say, sort of resentment. It's
Mhm.
also certainly part of the identity politics that have become so common, especially among the youth. And, I was just talking to someone yesterday and mentioned this. And one of the things that a lot of people have to understand is that the protests at GW and a lot of the protests this past year, they were orchestrated by people who came into these universities in 2020, right? We are at peak DEI. We are at peak BLM riots. We are at everything is about social justice activism. I was a former student at George Mason University. I went to graduate school there and quit because I thought the program was effectively fraudulent. We can
Hmm.
discuss education at length, but I remember the provost coming out and saying that DEI and social justice activism is what the core mission of the university, right? So you have to think these people who are at these camps. I mean, I sympathize with them a little bit because they are brought into this environment. They are taught by their administrators, by the most senior faculty and most public faculty, that social justice activism is what this place is about, and that is what we're going to teach you, right? So here we are 4 years later, they're graduating, and what? Now Israel's off limits. I can understand some of their anger or feelings of betrayal at the university administrators who, for the past 4 years have raved and ranted about social justice activism, and now it's all hands off. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Absolutely.
So
Hmm.
I got that sense from from many of the participants that they had felt they felt betrayed by
Hmm.
GW's administrators and indeed the Biden administration too. It's all about DEI and social justice. And well, here we are, and we're not going to do anything about this. So what gives? So, I have some sympathy for them because I'm sure that's confusing as a young person. But at the same time, I think the jig is up in a lot of
Absolutely.
these movements, and they're certainly connected.
Absolutely.
The history of DEI, we can trace back to Soviet influence operations and radical activists in the 1960s. You can do much of the same with the Palestinian liberation movement. We could go on and on. So these are,
Absolutely.
two sides to the same coin. We can't blame the Soviet Union, but we can still certainly blame the radical activists that assisted the Soviets. We can still certainly blame the same problematic autocratic governments in communist China or Putin's Russia. And, uh, some of those same players are still around. I mean, Angela Davis, for example, is a
Hmm.
key figure in that story. And she's still kicking,
Yep.
She's been rehabilitated by the left wing. So it's not like we're dealing with a new cast of characters here. It's the same players. There's just younger people in the mix as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of already answered this, but I would kind of like you to go deeper into it. In what ways do you think universities are complicit in stoking the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing on campuses, if they are at all?
Oh, I think they're absolutely complicit.
Hmm.
You know, one of the things. Okay, so basically with DEI, you have this very much supposedly pro-black and pro-minority notion, but I think that it's largely a lie. I think that they've been effectively deceiving minorities into taking on student loans that they really can't pay back, putting them in environments where they're not prepared to succeed, and I think that's just sinful. It's funny when you hear the leftist professors talk about capitalism's exploitation of the youth. It's like, well, for the majority of college students, is it any different than what you're doing? They don't really like that question. But the thing is that I think DEI hurt everybody. I was raised to not really consider race at all, ever. And we were working toward the same goal of, yeah, okay, there might be some differences, but we're all still human beings. And DEI just took that movement and drove a dagger in its heart. And, you know, so now you've got this supposedly pro-black, but kind of hypocritical, supposedly pro-minority, but especially hypocritical when it comes to Asian Americans. And then, of course, they're relatively anti-white. And the Jews are kind of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to anti-white sentiment, right? They're sort of the easiest go-to targets, and I think that's fairly clear, you know. So yeah, I think that DEI is extremely problematic, and that rests at the feet of these university administrators, without a doubt. You know, they are the ones that instituted this. They're the ones that put it in every department. They're the ones that hired the deans to promote it. They're the ones that recommended the books that produce these toxic ideas like, oppressor versus oppressed narratives and demanding that we all see the world through a lens of racial power. It's like these are not good ideas. People warned you, and now here we are a couple years later, and you have students on campus targeting Jews. You know,
So,
so you
so
don't want to continue down that road by any means.
of course not. So what can we as members of the public do to spread awareness about this problem and the growing rise of anti-Semitism in our country?
I would say that we need to return to, a sort of colorblind meritocracy and that vision that up until relatively recently, we had all agreed upon, where we were all human beings, we were all fellow Americans. We had this superordinate identity of just being people, right? Not black or white or gay or straight, of just being people that are deserving of the respect of, just a fellow human being. That's what we need to return to, and we need to call out the people who are trying to subvert that mission. So
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I saw in your Twitter bio that you studied political philosophy. And so I
sir,
was actually quite interested in getting your take on this particular portion. What would you say? We kind of went into Marxism and everything, but there are some people that would also say that these radical activists are driven by this insatiable desire to deconstruct and to stabilize anything that stands in the way of their self-expression. So in other words, some folks would call them postmodern. Would you agree with that characterization at all? And if you do or if you don't, I would like to know what you think about what worldview is guiding their actions, other than Marxism.
yeah, okay, so that's a complicated
Oh yeah,
question.
I know.
I would say, to give a rundown of it, it begins with Marx. We could
Mhm.
say one can argue that it begins with Marx, but I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's really the correct view that people go with. I think that it actually begins with the story of Cain and Abel, which in the
Mhm.
Judeo-Christian canon is the first story of human beings. All right. Adam and Eve don't really count. They were born, or they weren't born. They were created directly by God. They lived in a paradisal state for who knows how long, right? So the first story of human beings is the story of Cain and Abel. And of course, Cain murders Abel out of his envy because God favors Cain. So, I'm sorry, God favors Abel. Abel appears, if you read the story, and it's not very long, it's just a couple paragraphs. If you read the story, it seems like God favors Abel because of his ability to make the proper sacrifices. Okay. And Cain, for whatever reason, Cain's sacrifices are not accepted by God. Perhaps they're just petty little sacrifices. He's not sacrificing much, or he's not doing it correctly. So Cain gets mad and he murders his brother Abel. And so I mentioned earlier the spirit of Cain. I think that's what a lot that you see is Marxism, postmodernism, whatever ism you want to call it,
Mm.
is really this sort of wordplay and camouflage to what is effectively resentment toward those who have it better than you, right? And so, and I think that sort of satanic inversion of the proper mode of being is present in Marxism. I mean, it's literally the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto is Marx's comparison of the communist movement to this demonic force that is in need of exorcism. And he
Mm,
actually,
Spectre.
like, it is,
Yeah.
yeah, a specter is
Yeah.
haunting Europe, the specter of communism.
Mhm.
And he goes on to state exactly that a holy alliance, his words, has risen up to exorcise this specter. So he has compared communism to this demonic force, right?
Mhm.
People will say that, well, the new thing is culturally Marxist. I don't think that distinction is necessary, really,
Mhm.
because if you read even the Communist Manifesto, it's very clear that Marx was cultural as well. Everyone thinks of
Absolutely.
him as economic, right? He's an economic philosopher. And substantially, that's true. But if you read the manifesto, he goes on about the political system. He talks about the dissolution of the nuclear family. It's like those aren't, I mean, they're framed in economic terms, but that too is cultural. So
Absolutely.
people will make the distinction of cultural Marxism. It isn't particularly necessary. I understand why they do it, but then when Marxism failed, and I think that it really failed when Solzhenitsyn produced his works, the Gulag
Mm.
Archipelago, the intellectual game was up. People could see that this was not working, and so the postmodernists broke off from the Marxists. They acknowledged this in their writings, right? And
Mm.
the postmodernists then are a deviation from classical Marxism, which focused on the economy and some of culture. And the postmodernists went on to more abstract versions. And so there's kind of two camps in what we would call postmodern or neo-Marxist. You have the real postmodernist who see everything, and I do mean everything, through a lens of power, right? That reality itself is constructed as a sort of power game, and you get some really wacky interpretations going down that road. And then you have the ones who see the world in terms of more like political power, and those are the critical theorists. And so that's sort of the offshoots. You have critical theory, what we'd call postmodernism, and then both of them being deviations or branches from the Marxist tree, which I don't think ends at Marx. I think it goes back to the human nature to envy those who have made the proper sacrifices or may have just gotten more lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. We could go on forever about this, by the way.
Oh
So
yeah,
favorite topics,
yeah.
but we don't have the time for that today. Before we go,
Yeah.
Mason, by the way, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything you'd
Oh,
like
thank you.
to plug for our guests to be on the lookout for, or anything you'd like to promote?
Oh, well, let's see. In terms of promotion, the National Association of Scholars, of course, is a professional membership organization. So, join, please, if you're up for it. And there's two books that I'd highly, highly recommend that people read. First is Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. They go into the nitty-gritty on postmodernism and critical theory and its faults. And the second is Juliana Polon's book, An Idea Betrayed. It's about Jews and liberalism and why the Jews have for so long voted more with the left wing than the right wing and issues to that front. So, there's one other point that I can make, and it's that in terms of the Jews, or and particularly some of the more affluent white people who are on the left wing, you're really playing with fire here. These are some radical activists. They do not have your interest at heart. They do not have the country's interest at heart. They seek destruction. And if there's anything further to be learned from the Bible, um, it's that the first mistake that humans made was not eating the fruit of the forbidden tree, right? It was giving snakes the benefit of the doubt. So don't don't give snakes the benefit of the doubt. That really is the very first lesson, or at least among the first lessons that humanity is supposed to learn, and we continue to fail. So
It's a very wise aphorism, and that's a very good
yeah,
closing point as well. Mason, thank you so much for being here.
yeah.
And
Thank you
everyone
very
else, please
much.
have a nice day. Bye.